Hey y'all! Thought we'd pop in today to talk about how to read a sewing pattern without losing your mind. Because, let's be honest, the first time you open one of those envelopes, it feels less like you're about to make a shirt and more like you've accidentally intercepted secret government documents. You unfold the tissue paper, it keeps unfolding, and suddenly you're standing in your craft room wrapped in enough paper to audition as a mummy. Somewhere under all those mysterious lines and tiny symbols is the project you actually want to make. The good news is that sewing patterns aren't trying to trick you. They just have a terrible first impression. Once you know what you're looking at, they become surprisingly logical. And today we're going to translate all that sewing gibberish into plain English. The first thing to understand is what a sewing pattern actually is. It's basically a blueprint. If you've ever assembled furniture from a box, you've already survived something that can be considerably more confusing. At least with sewing patterns, you usually end up with clothing instead of one mysterious screw left over that you convince yourself was probably optional. A pattern contains the shapes you'll cut from your fabric, instructions for putting everything together, and enough information to make sure your finished project actually resembles the picture on the front. Think of it like a recipe. The ingredients are your fabric and notions. The recipe is the instruction sheet, and the pattern pieces are the cookie cutters. Skip a step and things can get creative. Sometimes creatively wonderful. Sometimes creatively shaped like a potato. Before you even open the envelope, there's a surprising amount of useful information sitting right on the outside. The front usually shows the finished project, sometimes with different versions using the same basic pattern. That's your chance to decide whether you're making the version with sleeves, with a collar, without a collar, or the version that makes you wonder why fashion designers occasionally wake up and choose chaos. Flip the envelope over, and you'll find the fabric recommendations, the notions you'll need, and probably the most important thing of all, the size chart. This is where many new sewists discover that pattern sizing and store sizing have apparently been avoiding each other since sometimes around the Industrial Revolution. If you've ever proudly announced, "I'm always a size 10," a sewing pattern may respond by laughing politely before suggesting you're actually something entirely different. Don't take it personally. Sewing pattern sizes are based on body measurements, not the numbers hanging on the clothing racks in the stores. Retail sizing has drifted all over the place over the decades, while many pattern companies have stayed much closer to older measurement standards. The tape measure doesn't care about your feelings, your favorite pair of jeans, or that one magical sweater that somehow fits everybody. It just reports the facts. So grab your measurements, compare them to the chart, and let the numbers guide you instead of your ego. Your sewing machine is far less judgmental than your dressing room mirror. I promise. Now comes the part that scares almost everyone. Opening the pattern. Inside you'll find tissue paper so thin it seems to tear if you merely think about scissors too loudly. It's covered with overlapping lines and strange symbols and arrows and numbers and enough squiggles to convince you someone let a caffeinated spider design the whole thing. Resist the urge to stuff it all back in the envelope and pretend knitting was your real passion all along. Every one of those lines has a purpose. You're only following the ones for your size. And once you focus on those, the entire page suddenly becomes much less intimidating. It's a little like finding your route on the road map instead of trying to drive every highway in the country simultaneously. Each pattern piece has its own job, and thankfully they're usually labeled. You'll find things like front bodice, back bodice, sleeve, collar, pocket, cuff, waistband, and other pieces that sound perfectly reasonable until you somehow sew the sleeve where the pocket was supposed to go. Don't ask me how I know people manage that. I'm not going to tell you. Pattern pieces also tell you how many to cut and whether they should be placed on a fold in the fabric. If a piece says cut 2, don't decide 1 is close enough. That's how you end up with a shirt that has one sleeve and an exciting opportunity to explain your artistic vision. The pattern isn't being bossy. It's simply trying to prevent future conversations that begin with, "Well, this wasn't exactly the plan." One of the most important markings you'll find is the grain line arrow, and while it doesn't look particularly exciting, it's quietly doing some heavy lifting. Fabric has a natural direction because of the way it's woven, and garments behave much better when the pattern pieces follow that direction. Ignore the grain line, and your finished shirt may decide one shoulder belongs somewhere near your elbow after a couple of washes. Pants might twist around your legs like they're trying to escape. Skirts can hang unevenly enough to make people wonder if you're standing on a hill. Lining up the grain line takes a few extra moments, yes, but it's one of those tiny details that separates "I made this" from "I made this," and it appears to have developed opinions. You'll also notice little triangles, circles, dots, and other mysterious markings sprinkled around the pattern pieces. These are your construction landmarks. Those little notches are like tiny GPS markers that help matching pieces find each other during assembly. The dots often indicate where darts begin, where pockets belong, or where you'll pivot while sewing. They may seem insignificant when you're cutting everything out, but halfway through construction you'll suddenly realize they're saving you from sewing something upside down, backward, or inside out. It's remarkable how often fabric can convince you that left is right until these little markings step in and politely say, "Actually, no." They're tiny heroes wearing very modest uniforms. One final piece of advice before we move on. Don't feel obligated to cut up your original pattern, especially if it's a multi-size pattern you might want to use again. Many sewists prefer tracing the size they need onto separate pattern paper or lightweight interfacing, leaving the original untouched. Think of it like making photocopies of an important document instead of writing directly on the original. Future you may decide to sew the same pattern for someone else, alter the fit, or maybe even revise it after learning a few new techniques. Future you will appreciate present you for not enthusiastically attacking the original with scissors after 3 cups of coffee and a rather dangerous amount of confidence. Once you've figured out the pattern pieces, it's time to tackle that instruction sheet. This is the part many people skip because they think, "I've assembled enough things in my life, I've got this." Those same people are often found 20 minutes later wondering why they have 2 left sleeves and what appears to be a pocket attached to the neckline. Read the instructions before you thread your machine. Really read them. Think of them as directions from someone who's already driven down this road and would rather you avoid the same potholes they hit. It only takes a few minutes, and those few minutes can save you several hours of carefully removing stitches while questioning every life choice that led to this exact moment. You'll also notice diagrams showing how to lay your pattern pieces on your fabric before cutting. At first glance, they can look like someone dumped puzzle pieces onto a blanket and declared victory, but they're actually designed to help you use the fabric efficiently. Fabric isn't getting any cheaper, and neither is the emotional damage of realizing you're 6 inches short because you decided to freestyle the layout. Follow the suggested arrangement as closely as you can. Pay attention to fabric width and whether the fabric is folded. There's something deeply satisfying about fitting every piece exactly where it belongs. It's like winning a very quiet game of Tetris, except the prize is not having to buy yet another yard of fabric. As you read through those instructions, you'll start running into sewing terms that sound mysterious until someone explains them. Right sides together simply means putting the pretty sides of the fabric against each other before sewing. I know it feels a little backwards until you turn everything right side out, and suddenly the seam is magically hidden inside where it belongs. Seam allowance is that little strip of fabric between your stitching line and the edge of the fabric. Most commercial sewing patterns already assume a standard seam allowance, so don't decide to eyeball it unless you're feeling unusually adventurous. Sewing is wonderfully forgiving in many ways, but random seam allowances are an excellent way to discover just how creative fabric can become. Don't overlook the little markings you've transferred from your pattern onto the fabric. Those notches, dots, and placement lines might seem like tiny details while you're cutting, but during construction they become your best friends. They're constantly whispering, "Match me to the other notch," or "The dart starts right here, not somewhere in the next postal code." Skipping these markings is a little like deciding to assemble a bookshelf without looking at which holes line up with which shelves. Technically, something might still get built. Whether it resembles the picture on the box is another matter entirely. A few extra minutes with tailor's chalk can save you from inventing entirely new geometric shapes in fabric. Before you cut into that beautiful fabric you've been saving for the perfect project, do yourself one enormous favor and prepare it properly. Most fabrics appreciate a trip through the washer and dryer before you sew them because many shrink the first time they're washed. It's heartbreaking to spend hours making a lovely shirt, only to have it come out of the laundry sized perfectly for an enthusiastic Labrador Retriever. Give the fabric a good press with the iron as well, because wrinkles have an uncanny ability to convince you that perfectly straight lines are actually crooked. Then pin or weigh down your pattern pieces, cut carefully, and resist the temptation to rush. Fabric is remarkably patient. Scissors are remarkably permanent. Every sewist makes mistakes, and honestly, they're almost a rite of passage. Nearly everyone has sewn something inside out, or attached a sleeve backwards, or forgotten to mirror a pattern piece, or proudly completed an entire seam before realizing the fabric was facing the wrong direction. If you haven't done one of those things yet, congratulations. You probably will next Tuesday. The important thing is remembering that mistakes aren't proof you're bad at sewing. They're proof you're actually sewing. Seam rippers exist because even experienced sewists occasionally need to have a quiet conversation with their stitching. Mine gets enough exercise that it probably deserves its own personalized parking space beside the sewing machine. The wonderful thing about learning to read sewing patterns is that eventually they stop looking intimidating altogether. After you've worked through a handful of projects, you'll start recognizing symbols automatically, anticipating construction steps, and spotting clever techniques in ready-made clothing. You'll even find yourself looking at a jacket in a store and thinking, I know how they put that together. That's both empowering and slightly dangerous, because suddenly every garment becomes a potential future project. Your fabric stash grows. Your pattern collection expands. You begin saying things like, I could totally make that, while your sewing room quietly wonders where you're planning to store yet another stack of fabric. The biggest secret I can share is that confidence doesn't come before experience. It comes because of experience. Nobody opens their very first sewing pattern and instantly understands every symbol, every instruction, and every construction technique. We all start somewhere, usually with a little confusion and maybe a tiny bit of dramatic sighing. The difference between a beginner and an experienced sewist isn't that one never gets confused. It's that the experienced sewist has learned that confusion usually lasts about 5 minutes before everything suddenly clicks into place. So don't let a complicated-looking pattern scare you away. Every successful project starts with unfolding that slightly terrifying sheet of tissue paper and deciding to give it a try anyway. Well, y'all, that's about it. I'd love to hear about the funniest sewing mistake you've ever made, or whether you've got a pattern sitting in your craft room that's been intimidating you for months. Leave a comment and let us all laugh together, because every experienced sewist has a story that starts with confidence and ends with a seam ripper. If today's chat helped make sewing patterns seem a little less mysterious, then we've accomplished exactly what we set out to do. They really aren't secret codes or impossible puzzles. They're simply another crafting skill that gets easier every single time you practice it. So dust off that pattern, thread your machine, and remember that every stitch teaches you something new. Happy stitching!